Our topic tonight is exegesis, how to read the Bible like a scholar. This fancy word, exegesis, comes, of course, from Greek. Exegesis literally means leading out. What we mean by this is the exercise of critical reading, critical interpretation of the text, that is drawing out as much information from the text without putting into the text our own biases, our own information. And this is something that doesn't simply apply to reading the Bible. You can use the same exegetical tools when you approach any text, even when you read the news, and we'll see why. Now, when we say critical reading, critical interpretation, we don't mean that you have to be negative or hostile about it. In fact, it's not about how you feel about the text, so it's not about rejecting or accepting the text. What exegesis is about is analysis. It's an analytical, academic approach to any kind of text, in this case, biblical text. What critical reading entails is understanding the context. That means who is the author of the text, when was the text written. Also, we have to look at the language, where the author is writing from, and what can we know about the culture. Not only the author, but also who is the audience, who is the author writing for, who are the first readers or the first listeners of these stories. As well as you can keep asking questions like what sources we have. Now, why is this important? And why I say you maybe should not read the Bible if you have no idea about exegesis. As I mentioned, exegesis means to draw out of the text, to extract information from the text for the purpose of interpreting the text. Whereas our natural tendency, what we all do, is absolutely the opposite. What scholars call eisegesis or eisegesis, which means drawing in. You're reading into the text. What does that mean? When you read into the text, whether it's the Bible or any other text, you bring into your reading a lot of presuppositions, a lot of assumptions. Now, that might be okay if you're reading the Bible, in this case, for devotional purposes, if you're praying, if you're in a worship setup, or if you're doing some meditative practice, spiritual practices like Lectio Divina, you might bring your own beliefs, your own intentions into the reading. But when you move into interpreting the text, just trying to just reveal, uncover the real meaning of a difficult passage. And often people do that when they have to write a sermon. Now, if you bring presuppositions and assumptions in those cases, then that's a bad idea. Reading into the text is a very subjective exercise because we all have an agenda. We all have biases. So what often we do in this case is we're going to look at the text. We're going to cherry pick verses and passages to confirm a belief that we already have. And usually that means we're going to find tools to justify a position. And you can think of people doing that even when we read the news today, that we're just trying to read the news, that we only go to the sources and the information that already confirms what we believe, and justify what we already think are political positions. So exegesis can be applied to any kind of reading. Now, this is what most people do when we approach the text. Just without any knowledge of exegesis, you are going to read into the text. So let's read these passages, just a couple of verses from the book of Genesis. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. The rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. On the very same day, Noah with his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons entered the ark, they and every wild animal of every kind, and all domestic animals of every kind, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every bird of every kind, says Genesis chapter 7, verses 11 through 14. Now, when we approach this text without any knowledge of exegesis, our tendency is to read into the text, into Genesis 7, 11, 14. Now, many readers will approach this text with the assumption that this is the Word of God. As a result, it must be true. Because it must be true, it's either something that happened, a historical event, or at least it has a core. It must have a core of historicity. Now, this is usually what we call the literalist, creationist reading approach to the Bible. For example, when you read the fountains of the great deep burst forth, I did a little bit of research today, and there's all sorts of speculative theories that people have come up with in modern times that involve plate tectonics, shifts in the Earth's crust, volcanic activity, hydrothermal vents, which imposes modern geology and other modern science into the text, bringing things that the original authors and the original audience had no idea about. This other passage, the windows of the heavens were opened. Now, I found that some people speculate this might be related to meteor impacts that created just a crazy amount of clouds and atmospheric changes on Earth, and that may have triggered global rainfall, or there's also some speculative theories about, well, this has to do with a sudden global ice age melt. Of course, these are all speculative theories or hypotheses, often impossible to confirm. But there's other, I would say, more inoffensive, less irresponsible interpretations that come in modern times that are modern spiritual readings that mix a little bit of New Age spirituality and psychology. For example, when we talk about the fountains of the deep, some people will suggest, well, this has to do with suppressed emotions or trauma, and that suddenly it just rises to the surface of consciousness. It becomes conscious all of a sudden, and this is something that also can be cleansed through baptism. This is something that is a revelation, spiritual revelation of a deep mystery that can happen in these moments of just great emotional and psychological change. And these spiritual readings also might talk about like seeing all the rain as all the problems, all the negative energy that rains on us, and God's grace as this redeeming, helping hand that saves us from this flood of problems. And so instead of problems is God's blessing that is poured on us. So this is one of the alternative New Age kind of readings. But once again, spiritual readings impose a little bit of psychology, a little bit of Christian theology that is not really original in the text, in the original intentions. Modern literalist readings simply try to justify the Bible, to confirm its historicity, its scientific accuracy, if you will, and also its inerrancy, assuming that the Bible cannot be wrong if the Bible is the Word of God. Now, that's when we read into the text. But what if we draw out of the text without putting anything into the text, without bringing any assumptions into our reading? This is what we call the exegetical approach. In this presentation, we will go through 6 steps of this process. There are more, and you don't always have to follow all these steps, and you don't also have to follow them in this particular order. This is an overview. So we will see textual criticism, linguistic analysis, historical and cultural background analysis, form criticism, literary context, and we'll look at the intended audience and message. So let's start with textual criticism. This is basically looking at the manuscript traditions, because when we look at the manuscripts, we often find small differences, and every now and then you might find a very significant difference that might suggest a different interpretation. Usually what we look at when we do textual criticism are the complete codices that we have. We have the Masoretic text that is a complete Hebrew copy of the Bible that dates to the 11th century, is primarily in Hebrew. It doesn't mean that it was composed in the 11th century. It means that the documents themselves were written down 1,000 years ago. So that's the oldest complete copy that we have of the Bible in Hebrew. Of course, we have, you might be thinking of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the Dead Sea Scrolls do not contain a complete, the complete text of the Hebrew Bible. The Septuagint is the other complete source that we have, and is much older. The oldest copy that we have of the Septuagint is from the 4th or the 5th century CE, even though it was composed in Egypt, in Macedonian, in Hellenistic Egypt, in the 2nd century BCE. But the copy that we have, the oldest complete copy, dates back to the 4th or 5th century CE. So this is what we usually work with, for the Old Testament at least. When we look at this particular passage of Scripture, we see minor differences between the Hebrew and the Greek. For example, the Hebrew talks about windows when the Greek talks about floodgates. Now, this is a very minor textual difference. There's usually minor differences like that when we compare records that are in 2 different languages. But in this case, when we look at the whole passage, the wording is very consistent. So we can trust that our interpretation is going to be consistent regardless of what manuscripts we use. Now, that's not always the case. Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, for example, is one of those cases where the manuscripts have significant differences. The Masoretic text reads, "When the Most High apportioned the nations, ... He fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel." Masoretic text from the around 1008 AD, whereas both the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls, of which we have older copies, say that according to the number of the sons of God, not the sons of Israel. Now, why is this significant? Because by the time scholars were writing down the Masoretic text that we have today, there was an emphasis put on showing a strict monotheism. When we talk about sons of God, that echoes ancient Canaanite imagery of a divine council of the god El and all the sons of El. And so that's why the older copies still use the phrase sons of God, and in the modern, the more modern, more recent manuscripts, that word has been changed for a theological reason, and that affects interpretation, of course. Do not confuse textual and source criticism. There's a lot of criticisms. Textual is this. It's like just looking at the stability and the nuance of the wording across manuscripts. Whereas source criticism that you might be thinking of identifies editorial weaving of different traditions with different emphases. What does that mean? Well, we say that, for example, this passage of Genesis comes from the P source, from the priestly source. Now, in another lecture, the documentary versus the supplementary hypothesis, and this slide is actually from the Lost Gospel of Q, John explains how the texts of the Old Testament, as we have them today, are most likely, and this is hypothetical, we don't actually have the sources, but scholars propose two hypotheses to explain these often difficult to add up quirkiness in the text. This repetition, this duplets, this contradictory passages that sometimes are one right after the next, by saying that there were different authors, different traditions, different redactors at different times added new text, compiled different sources into one, and this is the documentary hypothesis. And the supplementary hypothesis will say that no, there was one source, and then later authors simply added to that source, as opposed to having a tree like the documentary hypothesis suggests. So that's textual criticism. It's not, I would say, essential that you do textual criticism. It might help. You do need to have access to good commentaries, like something like a commentary like this that only talks about the Pentateuch. But you can skip this for sake of time and just move directly to the linguistic analysis. And this is very important. That is the study of the words and grammar. Sometimes it's called the grammatical criticism, but it's not just the grammar of the text. It's also, you have to do word studies. Now, most of us here, at least in North America, in the West, not everyone speaks Hebrew, not everyone speaks Greek. So there's a lot of nuance in the original language that is lost to us. What we do in this step of the exegetical method is to just try to understand the nuance of the language, of the original language, looking at different translations and using what is called tools like concordances and lexicons in Greek and Hebrew. What is all this? Look, for example, at the passage that we're considering today in two different translations in English. As we saw before, this passage says, "All the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened." This is the New Revised Standard Version. And this is a formal translation, which means it's a translation that is often the preferred translation for English-speaking scholars. It's formal because it is word by word, practically. So there are other translations that are called dynamic, that instead of translating word by word, will instead try to communicate the meaning of the text as opposed to doing a word by word translation. One of those dynamic translations is the New Living Translation, which says, "All the underground waters erupted from the earth, and the rain fell in mighty torrents from the sky." Now you look at here, it's more or less the same idea. But what you have, if your preferred translation of the Bible reads more like the New Living Translation, you're going to access something that is going to be understandable. Yeah, there was water and it rained, but that's about it. The fountains of the great deep are translated as underground waters, and the windows of the heavens is just the sky. So there's all this poetic and rather esoteric language that we read in the New Revised Standard Version is lost in the New Living Translation. Now, the argument is, well, but it helps you understand the text. But does it help you when you're trying to really understand what the text is talking about? We'll see about that. What you do next is to use these interlinear translations, where you see side by side the original language with a language that you understand. In this case, you have the Hebrew and in English, and you can see at the bottom on the right side, so you have to read from the right to the left there, that the Hebrew says the fountains of the deep. It doesn't say, like the literal translation of the Hebrew text doesn't say underground waters. It's more poetic than that. Now, you might say, well, I don't know what the author means by the fountains of the deep. So that's when you go to the next tool that helps you dive deep, the concordances, which is basically like an index that allows you to find all the occurrences of the same text, of the same word, of the same expression sometimes, that happen throughout the Bible. And so in this case, for example, we see that there are 21 occurrences of this phrase, of the deep, and one of them appears in Genesis 1, verse 2, the surface of the deep and the spirit. And finally, you have lexicons that are basically dictionaries that, in some of them, if it's a good scholarly lexicon, will have pages and pages and pages on just one term in Greek or in Hebrew. And this allows you to really understand the nuance, how the word was used in ancient times. And so using lexicons, we can really see that the author, by the deep, doesn't really mean just underground water. The word in Hebrew is pronounced tehom, and the word abyssos in Greek, they both communicate the idea of something primeval, something, the primeval ocean, the abyss, which is not simply water, but it communicates the idea of chaos, of lack of order, of darkness as opposed to light. Once you have a sense of the language, and at the very least, even if you don't have access to a lexicon, these tools are available online, And same thing for comparing translations. There's a lot of websites where you can have access to multiple translations of the Bible. The next step is what you have to do. You have to spend, if you're not going to have a lot of time doing exegesis, you should at least do step 3 here, the historical and cultural background analysis. So you want to find out what the socio-cultural context of the text is. This is what sometimes is called historical criticism. Some theologians will present this as you have to look at the history in the text and the history of the text, which is a little misleading. And that's why I have history in the text here in scare quotes, because it's not history that you're looking at necessarily. The text might have historical references. The text might talk about real places. It might talk about historical characters, kings. It might talk about events like wars that really happen. But we cannot try, just because the text talks about real people and real places, doesn't mean that what we have is a historical account that we can trust. So historical criticism, the power of this step is that we can take a look at the social culture and historical context of composition. This is what the history of the text means. We look at the date of composition, at the authorship, at the sociopolitical context, the cultural context, and also we look at what traditions and parallels, especially extra-biblical parallels, we can identify. In the case of Genesis 7, 11, 14, the date of composition that most scholars agree on is later, is from the Exilic, or more likely the early Persian period. We're talking about from the 6th through the 5th century BCE. And this is the time from after the destruction of the first Jerusalem temple by Babylon, the time of the Babylonian captivity, and more likely the time of the return when these exiles are returning to the land after 60 years or so. So this is the most likely date of the timeline of the composition. Of course, I have a timeline here for you. Although the text, this is why the difference between the history in and the history of the text might be a little misleading, because the text is talking about a time period that is primeval. It's like a time immemorial. But the text is not written at the time that the events that it describes. The text is most likely written in this red period here that we see that says at the bottom, Persian Judea, with the province of Yehud. And so we can see in context more or less when the authors, the priestly circles, were composing these texts. The scribal priestly circle is what we identify as the authors of this text. It's not just one author, it's a tradition of authors. We can identify this priestly author by this tradition because of their focus on precise dates. For example, in our passage, they are really explicit about making sure that you know the exact day that this happened. Not the year and the month and the day. They want to make sure that things happen with precision. They give formal lists. They often are interested in cosmic theology, in things that involve all humanity and the universe as a whole, as opposed to just a group of people, like a tribe, like just Israel. These stories that we get here in like this passage that we are analyzing today has cosmic significance. It's not just for Israel, but for all humanity. There's cultic purity and other concerns that these authors have, and that's what we can know about the authorship. The socio-political context, we know more about this. The time of composition is a time when the Judean exiles are either in Babylon or returning to the Persian province of Yehud, what used to be the kingdom of Judah and has become just a Persian province, which means Israel is no longer an independent political entity, but a province under the rule of a foreign king, a province that is experiencing foreign occupation. This is a time period after the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. So what the flawed story is presented here is a story of a new creation, a new beginning after a catastrophic event which people still remember. And it's important also in the text, it's clear that this new order is established and that God is always in command. God is sovereign. It's not the Persian king who is in charge. It's still God. This also came with an identity crisis. So after the destruction of the Jerusalem, the temple and the city in 586 BCE, all the exiles in Babylon start adopting Aramaic as opposed to like their ancestral language, Hebrew. Aramaic, remember, is the lingua franca of all these Mesopotamian empires at the time. And modern Hebrew today uses not the original Hebrew script for writing, but it uses the Aramaic script. The exiles in Babylon. So Babylon is the center of this magnificent empire of ancient times, this great big city. A lot of these exiles, these Judean exiles, actually prosper there. They begin to trade. They're able to find positions within the Persian court, and they're doing fine, at least some of them. There's also, we know, a diaspora in Elephantine that people are aware of. So the issue here is, how do we preserve our group identity as we're adopting the language of our captors, as we are intermixing with them for our trade, for our daily lives? So the text is also here pointing at the preservation and the reinforcement of identity of a vulnerable community within a much larger entity. And the cultural context is, well, here's one of my favorite things, of course, like the ancient Near Eastern cosmological model is very much present in this story. So all the assumptions of how the universe works that people in the ancient Near East had are very much present in this story. So the world is flat, and the sky is encased in what's called the firmament, which is a great dome that just wraps the earth from above and below. So all around this firmament are the waters, the cosmic waters of chaos. This surrounds the world, this bubble world, on all sides. This is from Genesis as well. And God said, let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. It continues, so God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome, the firmament. And it was so. God called the dome sky. So this is from Genesis. This is just before the passage that we're analyzing. But you can see here Genesis, the same priestly author, introducing this world, this cosmology, that then will collapse in the passage that we're analyzing with the Great Flood. The Mesopotamian cosmology is very similar to what the author of Genesis is presenting. The universe exists between cosmic waters, one of Apsu, which is like fresh water and the deep below, and the waters of Tiamat, the monster Tiamat, which is salt water that is above and around the livable world. So very much both the Mesopotamian cosmology and the cosmology that here Genesis is presenting imagines the earth like this flat surface. Let's go to the next slide that you can see a little bit better. This flat surface here that is completely surrounded by water, and the power of God or the gods is what has separated these waters so that life can exist on earth. But as you can see, there's also these windows and doors of heaven. So at any time, if God wills, waters can go through these windows and then all the sky is flooded. So this is what happens in our story. In the Enuma Elish, we have parallels. Marduk splits Tiamat, that is presented like this primeval monster, very much like Tiamat in the Old Testament. Not Tiamat, like Leviathan in the Old Testament. So Marduk, when he defeats this monster, it's a watery monster. Marduk, the god Marduk, splits this monster in two, and this is how the sky above is created and how the waters below are created out of the waters that burst out of the carcass of this primeval monster, which echoes what we see here in Genesis. We also have the parallel of Atrahasis or Utnapishtim, depending on if you read the Sumerian or the Akkadian stories, which is the hero of the flood story of Mesopotamia, as we read, for example, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, who is commanded by a god, like Enki, in the case of Utnapishtim, to build a boat or an ark and load it with his family and all sorts of animals. And another very interesting parallel comes from the same region, from the region of Canaan, in this Baal cycle that predates the Bible by quite a few centuries that we have from the records from the city of Ugarit in modern-day Syria. And in the Baal cycle, we hear of Baal's palace, which has a window. Now, the Prometheus of Canaanite mythology, of Canaanite religion, I should say, is called Kotharvahasis, who he's a craftsman, he's very smart, and when he's building this magnificent palace up on top of a mountain for Baal, he proposes the construction of a window, which Baal first refuses, and then comes to senses and says, oh yes, my palace here up in heaven needs a window, because through that window is how the god can let thunder and rain out on the earth. So there's an interesting, once again, parallel here between the windows that Genesis mentions and the window of Baal's palace in in the Baal cycle. Baal, who in this mythical story becomes the supreme god of the Canaanite pantheon. So that's an overview of historical and cultural background analysis, what sometimes we call the historical criticism, like looking at the author, at the date of composition, at the cultural background that makes sense of these metaphors that we're reading in the text. The next step is form criticism, and this is something that I feel is something that is easy to do. It shouldn't take too much time, but is often overlooked. So basically, it means to take a look at the genre and how the text was used in its original form. In the case of the text we're analyzing today from the book of Genesis, the genre is mythic narrative. More precisely, this is an etiological myth, an origin story. It's a primeval story. It's like a story of beginnings. Now, it uses the same cosmic imagery that we get from older cultures of the ancient Near East, like the windows of heaven, like the deep. These are theological, cosmological, concepts that are very much part of the culture of this whole region, not only of Israel. And then how was this story used by its intended audience, by the first readers or the first listeners of these stories? This is what sometimes in theology we call the setting in life. Sitz im Leben. Setting in life means, okay, so the story we have the story, and the story is of a particular genre, but how are people using this? For what? For what purpose? And we often have to reconstruct this based on every other piece of information that we collected during the exegetical process. So it's a reconstruction based on indirect evidence. And this reminds me that although when we look at the Bible today and we just hold one book in our hand, it looks like just one book, and it's a book that is associated with churches and synagogues. So it has a very contained, very limited purpose. It's religious. If you were to ask what's the genre of this book that you're holding in your hand, if you're holding the Bible, you say, well, it's religious. It's a religious text. But this is not true in ancient times. All these different books that are compiled into the Bible are of a diversity of genres. And so we have prophecies and books of wisdom, chronological histories, we have law, and we have the primeval story. For example, most of the Psalms that we have would be appropriate for temple worship. We know that many of these Psalms are actually hymns, that these Psalms were recited most likely and sung with melodies. The book of Leviticus has countless legalistic passages that were likely used in courtroom disputes. Things like genealogies could be used for land claims, for establishing someone's authority, for establishing someone's status. In the case of a mythic flood story, what is the setting in life? What is the purpose? What is the use that these ancient people were giving to such a text? Our best guess in this case is that this was an instrument to teach about divine justice. It's like a theological tool, theological device to say how God works in the world, how God responds to human violence with divine justice, and also is about identity building. And this is like, in general, etiologies have a lot of identity built into them. It tell a people, a group, where they come from, who they are. The next step is to find out the literary context. Now, don't confuse this with literary criticism. Literary criticism is another word that we can use to group many of the steps that we just looked at. The literary context is simply looking at how does this little passage, these 4 verses of Genesis, fit within the book. In other words, what happens before and what happens after this text? And this is something that even I've been to churches, many churches throughout my life, and every now and then you have a preacher and they are going to preach about a particular passage of often the New Testament without even knowing what the one verse before or the one verse after has to say. Just taking the Bible passage completely out of context is usually not a good idea for like a great sermon or a responsible interpretation of a biblical passage. So there's 2 ways to look at this. Like, you look at the immediate context, usually just the chapter that you're working with, or the broader context, and you can go as far as you want. You can take a look at the whole book that you're analyzing. If we look at the immediate literary context, we see that the before, God decides to destroy all life on earth, and then the after is that the waters cover the earth. So God has done it. God has moved forward with this plan to destroy all life. Now, you have to ask yourself, what is the function of the passage that we're looking at? This is a hinge moment. It is in this chapter, exactly in this year, this month, and in this day, that this changed, that God began to destroy the earth. So this is a hinge moment between the first creation that we get in Genesis 1 and the new creation that is going to come after God cleanses all the sin, all the problems of this earth that has gone rogue, has gone corrupt. If you look at the broader literary context within the book of Genesis, you can see that Genesis begins with this creation of the universe and creation of the human being. This is something that concerns all humanity. But later on in the book of Genesis, we are introduced with covenants, first with Noah, then with Abraham, then with Israel. And these later covenants are not covenants with all of humanity, but just with the chosen people of Israel. So how do we go from this universal concern to this tribal focus in Genesis? And so this function, the function of this text, is that it anticipates this shift from the universal focus that these early passages of Genesis have to the particular covenant between God and Israel in later chapters of Genesis. And finally, in the exegetical exercise that we're doing today, we're going to look at the intended audience and the intended message that the author was trying to communicate to this audience. We saw a little bit of this already. The original audience is post-exilic Judeans under Persian rules, either already back in Judea or still in Babylon, but really this is a post-exilic content. People are rebuilding the temple that was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar only 2 generations before. In rebuilding the temple, in rebuilding the cities of Judah, they're also rebuilding their identity. You have to look at the original message. The author here is communicating clearly the violence that was happening on earth, the disobedience of humanity disrupts what God has created, God's order. So God responds with judgment. God has to clean that up. That's part of the message, but also part of the message is that God will save a few and that will make a covenant with them. More importantly, catastrophe is not the end. Yes, something terrible happens in the story, which is the destruction of all life on earth, except the lucky ones who were on the ark. In the same way that catastrophe happened when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem and all of the cities of Judah, and even the Jerusalem temple, the house of God, and exiled the whole population. That was a catastrophe as bad as it gets, but it was not the end. Why? Because no matter what happens, the story is proposing God is sovereign. God is still in control. Everything that is happening is part of the plan. So that was the original message for the original audience. Now, later audiences will reinterpret this same text using the lens of their own context, a different context. Already, all the way back to the composition of the books of the New Testament, we see that even the New Testament writers, writing in the second half of the first century CE, already look at texts like this in the Hebrew Bible and use an approach that is called the typological interpretation. That is, when you read the text, you don't interpret it literally. You don't interpret what you read necessarily as something that really happened. You interpret it typological, meaning that what you're reading foreshadows something that is happening later. So in this case, the flood story, typologically interpreted, is a symbol of baptism. It foreshadows the baptism, and as you see here in this background image here, especially the baptism of Jesus, where we even have like the element of the dove that comes at the end. And another way of using typological approach to this story is Noah's Ark is now later on is interpreted as the church itself, the ones who are going to be saved. And you can see this even in the church fathers in antiquity, like Augustine. They knew not to, they already understood all the way back then into antiquity that these texts are not to be approached literally. We are not to be reading this text as if they were talking about actual events the way they happened, but typologically, allegorically, symbolically. However, modern fundamentalists will insist on literal readings, on approaching the text as if the text had historical and scientific accuracy, using all these speculative hypotheses like meteorites and plate tectonics to propose this models like the young Earth model, like the flat Earth model even. Now, if all were about just a few people thinking that the Earth is flat or that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, but that would be one thing. But also people will approach the Bible, read text, the passages of the Bible literally to oppress other people, to oppress minorities, to oppress women, to marginalize people, gays, trans, and so on. So how do we make responsible use of these texts that sometimes say things that can be quite problematic? First of all, do as much as possible before you use the text. Just make sure you know what the text is about. First, recognize the function of the text. In this case, this is like pushing like if you have an old computer, like a reset button to start from zero. It's a story of decreation. God had created the world. Now, in this story, God is decreating the first creation and recreating the world, a better world. The function here is to approach a community that is traumatized by war, by death, by displacement, by humiliation. A community that is experiencing identity challenges, a community that is trying to stay together as they're in a different land, not able to worship their God at their temple, forgetting their ancestral language even. So this is a community that is really struggling to preserve who they are, their identity. And you have to also recognize the theology in the text. It doesn't mean that it's going to be a good theology, but there's this particular theology that speaks to these people that are the first listeners, the first audience. The theology that we can recognize here is that God condemns corruption, God condemns disobedience, God condemns violence, sin. But God also is committed to preserve life. God renews relationship with us. So at the end of this whole story, God will make a covenant with Noah and will promise not to ever do this again. This is a one-time reset. The creation happened once, didn't go well, it happened again, but that's it. Now we're stuck with this creation, Noah. And more importantly, God is in control. And here that's a message for the Persian king. Yes, you might rule over Israel, but God is still sovereign. God is in control. This is a story of faithful resilience. It gives the community that has suffered through all these wars and displacement a paradigm for resilience. These are the 6 steps that we went through today. Now, if you have time and the resources available, you can continue. There's other steps that you can engage with that are like redaction, criticism, and here is the step where you're going to look at the sources and you're going to see, well, this comes from the P author, this is from the Yahwist, from the Elohist, this is actually part of something that was added later by a redactor in later centuries. So that's something that you would do with the redaction criticism. There's something that is quite interesting that you can do is structuralist criticism, that you're going after patterns in the text, because the text has a lot of literary devices like puns, duplets, triplets, and many other literary devices that the different authors use to add a little bit of nuance to the message. There's also canonical criticism that really looks at how the text function within the canon, within what we call the Tanakh, or what we call the New Testament. Now, this sounds like a lot, and it might not be something that you do every time you try to analyze a Bible passage. So where do you start from, and how deep do you need to go? Well, first of all, you need at the very least something like this, which is a study Bible, which has a lot of footnotes. So pretty much half of this Bible is footnotes. And the footnotes give you a little bit of this historical context, give you a little bit of information about the language, the original languages. So this is like the new Oxford Annotated Bible. Another thing that is very useful is a single volume commentary, at least, or a multi-volume commentary like this one. This is just one volume out of, I think, like 15. This is the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, NIB. And this whole volume is just the Pentateuch. So only the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So this one goes in depth. There's commentaries that will specialize in the language. There's dictionaries, lexicons. But at the very least, you can access Bible translations online, even like the interlineal translation tools, the concordances, to get a better sense of what it is that you're reading. And really, where to start, I would say, just try to understand this thing that we call the context first. Who wrote this passage? When? Where? Why? What was the agenda? What was this author? Why was it important for the author to communicate this message? And finally, for whom? Who were the first listeners? If you follow at least a little bit of that, you will at least begin to read the Bible like a scholar, or also like a theologian. So I hope you got some out of that, and I'm looking forward to seeing your questions. Thank you for staying. Thank you so much to Dave Anderson, to Ted Gemberling, and to Fire Ever Living for supporting the channel with your donations. Okay, we have a few questions here. So Winston Barquez asks about the best alternative to the documentary hypothesis. Would the Weisman hypothesis be a good alternative? I'm not extremely familiar with that hypothesis. I know that Weisman was writing in the early 20th century, and this hypothesis is that the text was composed by Moses using earlier sources. But I would say any hypothesis that proposes that Moses had some part of that Moses was involved in the composition of the Torah is the problem is we don't even know, we cannot even be sure that Moses is a historical character, and most likely he is not. So I would say, at least from the scholarly perspective, that's not a good alternative to explain how the text of the Bible came to be in the way that we have them today. As we saw, the supplementary hypothesis is one of the leading hypotheses that some scholars propose as an alternative to the documentary hypothesis. And that's because there are some scholars that think that it's sometimes very unlikely that this process where you pretty much just patch bits by bits, almost verse by verse sometimes, to get the text as we have it, and also because ultimately we don't have copies of what would have been the J source or the E source or the P source. However, when you look at even like the sources that we have for the whole Bible, look at the oldest complete copy of the Bible that we have. The copy was written down in the year 1008, so that's more than a millennia after the original texts were written down. So it means that even if we don't have the sources, it doesn't mean that they don't exist, and that's one of the main problems that some scholars have with the documentary hypothesis, that how come we don't actually have any evidence of these independent sources. Leon Berg. Thank you so much, Leon. Obrigado for supporting the channel. Mike, I may need to scroll up a bit. Thank you so much. Leon asks, are the modern books in English addressing both ancient Hebrew and ancient Greek poetry and turns of phrases? It depends on what, if you mean like the modern translations of the Bible in English, it depends on what translation you use. There might be more formal translation, like the KJV, the King James Version, is a very formal translation. It's inaccurate in other ways, but it's formal. The New Revised Standard Version is formal. If you use a more like a New Living Translation, which is more dynamic because it tries to convey not precise words, but the meaning of the sentences, the meaning of the phrases, then it's less likely that that's going to preserve the metric, the poetry. Even as we saw, it completely obliterates the metaphors that the original text uses, like the windows of heaven, the deep, and all these symbolism is gone in a dynamic translation. And even worse, if you use like a paraphrase translation that is even more relaxed than a dynamic translation, it's that for sure there's going to be very little of the original sense, feel of the text. David Latorre says, so does this textual difference indicate that monotheism was still not established by the 2nd century BCE? Not necessarily. By the 2nd century BCE, when the authors, when these authors, the translators of the Pentateuch are writing down the whole Bible in Greek in Alexandria, by then the idea of the monotheism was very well established, but the texts were quite recent, I would say. I think it's very possible that the scholars, these scholars that were doing these translations from Hebrew into Greek, had an understanding of this is how we say these things. The phrase "sons of God" is something that appears. It's a very traditional way of referring to certain functions within the divine realm. Sometimes it's used to refer to angels, for example. So sons of, I think it's Ben El, depending on what translate. I don't know exactly how you say it in English, in Greek, but this is something that appears multiple times in the tradition, and I think changing it at that time would have been inappropriate, would have sounded odd to most readers at the time who were already familiar with these stories, with these titles. Later on, already that's different. When we're farther removed from the actual date of composition of these sources, you're able to do all sorts of things, including like eliminating some books from the canon because they're not even in the original. You don't have them. So we have books of the Bible like the in the Septuagint that do not appear in the Masoretic text. All right, we have. I love this question by. I'm skipping some questions, but I love this question by Paula Strange. So I'm going to go there first because I was hoping someone was going to ask about this. What role can AI play in exegesis, and what are the limitations? So I tested that a couple times, and it was quite frustrating. I use sometimes, not necessarily for doing exegesis, but I do for other work that I do, like marketing. I use ChatGPT, and ChatGPT, as you know, has a lot of different models. There's one that is called the Scholar GPT that supposedly only looks at academic sources and gives you a trustworthy academic answer. But if you ask, there's two problems with AI. First, it always makes a lot of mistakes. So I asked, for example, what source is associated with this particular passage? And you would say, well, the sources are either J or E or P. And ChatGPT was wrong about that. The answer that ChatGPT gave me was flatly wrong. No, that's not most Scholar. It said it was like the Yahwist, and it's the P version. It's a P source. So ChatGPT can simply be wrong about it. But I think more problematic is sometimes ChatGPT would give me an answer, and I would say, well, I don't agree with that answer because I think that's, for example, that is very anti-Christian, or that is that's too atheist, or on the contrary, that's your answer is too religious. You are just give me a more academic answer. And when you push ChatGPT to go in the direction that your feelings are, it will, just to give you the answer that you're looking for. So that's the problem with AI. We can guide AI to give us the answers that we want to hear, and also it just makes mistakes. So yeah, commentary, if you want to dive deep into a text, is always, even if some commentators are not going to be spectacular, but at the very least are going to be legit. Let's go back up. Mary Magnuson, what if the original story was composed in Greek and then translated and written in Hebrew later? There is much evidence that Mosaic law was not practiced until after the 2nd century BC. Yeah, and that is another step that you can do in your exegesis, is not, when you analyze the historical, the cultural background, is to know not only, okay, when was the text written, but when did the text become widespread? the text or the stories, and ultimately when the text became authoritative, which is something that until recently people were not paying too much attention. Even scholars were assuming that, well, the composition of this particular book in the Bible dates to the 5th century BCE, so it means that at the time this particular book was already authoritative. And no, now modern scholarship says, well, we don't have evidence for that. The earliest evidence that we have for the widespread knowledge and adoption of these texts as authoritative, as you say, Mary, are around the 2nd century BCE, especially during the Maccabean period. But I wouldn't say that can tell us a lot about the translation. The texts are definitely earlier than the 2nd century BCE, even if we don't have complete manuscripts that date to older centuries. And there's another thing with the Septuagint that clearly tells you that it is a translation. It has Hebrew isms, so it's not how Koine Greek would have been written, like out from scratch, but it's clear that there's an effort of translating something from another language. Otherwise, you wouldn't write things in that particular way, which is something that happens when you translate any language. When, like, I often translate English into Spanish, and I look at what I translate, and no one would ever speak like that in Spanish from scratch, but that's what translations are. So I don't know, I don't have any evidence to suggest that this particular text, this particular passage that we are looking at here was originally composed in Greek and later translated into Hebrew. I think, okay, oh, there you go. David Latorre, once again. Could we say that at the time of King David, the Judeans and Israelites were culturally and religiously more like their Canaanite neighbors than the Israelites we think of in antiquity? The time of King David is supposed to be around the year 1000 BCE. Now, what we know at the time, like, this is like what is called the turn of the Iron Age 1 into Iron Age 2. We called these periods the Iron Age because we don't have a lot of texts. Like, the historical period proper starts usually is considered the Persian period. And why is that? It's because we almost have no historical records that are older than the Persian period. Very few. So we have some stelas, these stone monuments that are found throughout the Levant, in Israel, in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Palestine. We have ostraca, which are broken pieces of pottery where people sometimes use just to even practice the writing, even like for kids in school practicing the writing. So these are the sources, the actual sources of written text that we have. Very few. The very few things that we have that come from that period, from about 1000 BC, they don't give us any evidence that people already had this idea of the divine that we have today, or that even people had in the 2nd century BC and the 1st century BC. Divinity is still understood as a multiplicity of beings, all the way through the destruction of the first Jerusalem temple. That's the most likely scenario because of the concern that we have all the way into the destruction of Jerusalem, with the emphasis on the worship of Yahweh and as the only God. If people had already been worshiping just Yahweh at the time of David, there would be no reason for Josiah and the Deuteronomists to start these reforms. Now, an alternative to that sometimes it was used in the past, but it's a discredited hypothesis now, is that, well, people started monotheistic, but then because they started mingling with their neighbors, these evil Canaanites, then they became polytheistic. But there's even less evidence to suggest that. So yes, as you say, most likely the religious landscape at the time was not very different from the religious landscape of the late Bronze Age, which you have the worship of El, the worship of Baal, and the worship of the goddess Asherah, which is evidence all the way into even the kingdom of Judah period, with the Asherah poles, which are very spread around the region. Even the worship of Ishtar, the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar, is also practiced. The worship of the Mesopotamian consort of Ishtar, Tammuz, in Hebrew, in the Bible. So all these suggest that, yes, the landscape was very complex, not just one God. Let's go to mythology media. How close is ancient Hebrew and Aramaic? Are they closely related, like Danish, Swedish? I don't know either Danish or Swedish. They're very closely related. These are two Northwest Semitic language families. I don't think they're necessarily mutually intelligible. There's one instance. It comes from, is it First Kings, I think, where Israel is under siege, and the sieging general is speaking Hebrew to the people who are inside the walls of Jerusalem. I wish I could remember exactly the passage, but the Israelite defenders are saying, no, don't speak Hebrew to us, speak Aramaic to us. We understand, we are cultured people, we understand Aramaic. Don't speak Hebrew, because then if they speak Hebrew, all the population will understand. So that suggests, even in the Bible, that the languages were not mutually intelligible necessarily. Michael Karpowitz is right here and also asking in the live chat, Ninhotep said, ironically, apologists claim they have the real context, that is, looking at any passage through the lens of Christian tradition and theology. That makes me wonder, where does Christian tradition fit into the exegesis process? For example, are the writings of the early church fathers a tool that can be used in exegesis? Absolutely, because when we do exegesis, and this is something that we didn't go in depth with, but you have to, at some point, you have to sit down and start reading these commentaries. And the commentaries of the Bible are simply scholars who are reading a passage and analyzing it and writing their explanation of what the passage is saying. And yes, you go to all these like church fathers, their writings can be used in your exegetical process. Now that is usually, it adds one layer of complexity, would be for like a more in-depth exegetical process, as opposed to reading something that is very convenient. You would also have to, because you would have to apply the exegetical, at least some of the exegetical methods to some of these sources that are like very ancient. In general, you use modern sources, and the modern sources might tell you, like commentaries like this that are very complete will tell you, yes, Origen said this and that about this, and Augustine said instead that this means such and such. So you can get in modern commentaries what ancient fathers said. So that's an advantage. K. Tempest Bradford says, in terms of historical context and assumed audience, do we have data information on this for all parts of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament? No. And that's actually another problem when you ask ChatGPT or any AI about that to do the exegesis for you. Sometimes we don't have a lot of data for all the passages of the Bible, and the best we can say is we don't know, and you can propose an informed guess, but ChatGPT, AI will guess for you, and it often will simply speculate. And so that's where we have, that's where I would say responsible exegesis will say, we don't know. If you start considering the what ifs, yeah, but what if this and what if that, then you move into the speculative realm, and yeah, you could propose anything, but you're not going to have any evidence to support your position. And what we're trying to do in exegesis is not the what ifs. If you start asking what ifs, most likely you have an agenda. Most likely you already have an opinion. That's where your what if comes from. And so, no, there's a lot of passages in the Bible for which we don't have enough information, and at least for now. Julie Wisewski asks, can you speak about the overall trustworthiness of the manuscript tradition? The Dead Sea Scrolls seem to indicate it's very good because the texts were considered sacred. I'm not an expert on the manuscript tradition. It's a whole subdivision of like the Bible scholarship. There's multiple collections, these codices, the Vatican Codex and many other codices that are collections of manuscripts. Often the collections that we use are full collections, are collections that contain the whole Hebrew Bible or the whole New Testament, and that are scholars will supplement these complete codices. So these codices are collections that we can confirm are as the earliest complete source that we have of the whole canon. We do have other sources that are fragmentary. One of the most complete ones is, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that one is also very important because, as you saw, there's more than 1,000 years of separation between the Masoretic text and the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it can tell us a lot about, it can help scholars compare the Hebrew in the Dead Sea Scrolls with the Hebrew of the Masoretic text. And every now and then there are manuscript differences, as we saw in this passage of Deuteronomy that we analyze. But I would say the Dead Sea Scrolls, at least in my experience, is not one of the primary manuscripts that are used for exegesis, but they definitely add another layer of manuscript. When you don't have enough confidence on a manuscript tradition, what your manuscript tradition is telling you. Kinetic says, do you use any meditation or visualization practices that help put you in the shoes of the original biblical authors and readers to see the text through their eyes, being informed by their experience? Of course I do. I have many. Now, I haven't heard anyone including that as part of the formal approach to exegesis. Now, in many seminaries, I would say they recommend that you not only approach this as a scholar. So I'm a theologian. So for theologians, what most seminaries will suggest is that you also approach the text prayerfully. And it might be leading in the direction that you're asking. I don't think there's a precise exercise, meditation, or any kind of practice. Lectio Divina is something like that. It prompts you to put yourself in the shoes of the characters of the story. You can also put yourself in the characters in the shoes of the first listeners, and that can add a little bit of depth to your analysis. I don't often do that for my exegesis, but some theologians do. There's a note here. Oh, okay, so I think John added a little bit of context here. Yeah, like the story was about Sennacherib. So the king of Assyria that is threatening King Hezekiah of Judah at the walls of Jerusalem. And so this is the instance where the field commander of the Israelite army, of the Judahite army, Eliakim, says, please speak to your servants, meaning us, the Judahite officials, in Aramaic, since we understand it. Don't speak to us in Hebrew in the hearing of the people on the wall. So this is back to the note about whether these languages are mutually intelligible. Apparently not. Dartharama asks, bearing in mind the upcoming redo of the lecture on Christianity surviving the 21st century, do you think if churches moved toward a scholarly worship service, it would help? I think what would help is more honesty. A lot of ministers of most mainstream denominations, Protestant denominations and Catholics as well, have to go through seminary education to be able to be ministers, to be ordained. And even in the most conservative seminaries, you will learn about all these techniques. You might have a little bit more of a conservative perspective. You might assign more historicity to a text, but nevertheless, you will know how to approach the Bible critically, like we've seen today. However, I don't always attend worship services at this of my church, Community of Christ, where that often happens. But of other churches as well. Every now and then I have to sing in a choir at some other church of a different denomination, and I have to sit through a sermon and things like that. And there's not always a lot of honesty. I would say that the congregation is often somewhat patronized, as if telling the congregation the context would cause some kind of faith crisis. Yes, you have to be delicate about communicating the context, but I think there could be more honesty about that. And I think in that way, people would have a more adult understanding of the complexity of Scripture, so that Scripture is not something that you learn as a kid, and when you come to adulthood and you realize, well, this is not historically accurate, this is not scientifically accurate, this is rubbish, as one friend here in Toronto tells me sometimes, because he learned about the Bible as a kid, and in the churches he went to, that was how the Bible was presented as history, as science. So yes, it is. If that's how you use it, then it is rubbish. But if we, as ministers, as trained theologians, scholars, can help people find meaning and make responsible use of these texts for something good, for something that helps people, then that Christianity might have a chance. So Fire Ever Living says our most ordinary pastors train in reading the Bible exegetically. I would say depending on what denomination. I would say if you're like here in Canada, at least if you are ordained in the Catholic or the Anglican, the United Church of Canada, the Presbyterian Church, you do need a seminary degree, which will include training in exegesis, but not in every denomination. It's not in Community of Christ. You don't need to have a seminary degree to be a minister, but we do teach basic exegesis, how to read Scripture, to people who are going to be ordained. They have to go through a course. It's not like a university program, but they need to know the basics of exegesis, at least what we saw today, to understand how to use the Bible responsibly. I think that's it for tonight. Thank you so much for staying. Thank you so much for your questions. Don't forget to click like and to share this video to help us reach out to new viewers, or to help us continue to produce this content with a donation in the chat or at our website. We will be sending our next newsletter tomorrow, so if you haven't subscribed, please do so. centerplace.ca/sign up. Next week, we're going to look about the history of Akhenaten and the invention of monotheism. See you then.